Text. In today's lesson, we are going to look at styling typography. This is super valuable because so much of the look and feel of a website, its personality, comes through the typography. There's a lot of things that I'm going to teach you in this lesson that I didn't know until I'd already been a full-time web developer for a couple of months. So I'm excited to share this with you now. All right, the first property that we often want to change, one that we touched on in the last lesson, is font size. So as a refresher, there's two main ways we can set font size. One is with pixels and one is with rems. And we recommend that you use rems, but there may be instances where you use either. Maybe you're working with a graphic designer who's given you the dimensions in pixels and that's what they want you to use. So you can definitely use either. Rems are recommended and they're what I will be using in most of my demonstrations. So as a refresher on the syntax, we've got our element selector over here. We're selecting all of the H2s. We've got our curly brackets at the start and end. Then we've got our property, in this case font size, our value, 1.5 rem, that's how big we want it to be, and then a semicolon. And that's going to make all of our H2s 1.5 rems high. The next thing that everyone wants to change is the font family. Now, there's only a limited number of web-safe fonts that you can just use in the CSS without doing anything else. And that includes some that you've probably heard of, like Arial, Helvetica, Times New Roman, Korean New. The syntax is the same as what we've learned so far, except that we've got this little single quote mark around each one, just to tell us where that font name starts and ends. This is what those fonts look like. So the first one is Arial, Impact, Helvetica, Times New Roman, Korean New, Comic Sans, Verdana, and Georgia. You probably recognize some of these. Now, it's great that we have so much diversity already in what we can use in our CSS, but there's one small problem. Most of these browser-safe fonts are very generic. Some of them, I would argue, are pretty ugly. It doesn't necessarily feel professional to use them in the website because they have this 90s feeling about them, partly because in the 90s they were the only thing that you could use on the web. Luckily, there is a solution, and that solution is Google Fonts. Google Fonts is a repository of 915 free fonts that you can easily use with just a couple of clicks. I would say 99% of websites I develop use Google Fonts in their typography. So let's have a look at Google Fonts. So this is the Google Fonts website. When you first come to it, you'll see a whole list of fonts and you can scroll through. There's a lot of them, obviously. You can look for particular styles. So you can look for a serif font, which is where they've got these little, where's a serif font? Here, where they've got like little edges, I don't know the technical term for that, on the letters. You can look for a sans serif font like this one, a display font, a handwriting font, etc. So if you unclick, it'll show you only ones from that certain category. So handwriting would be more of the kind of unique fonts. You can also sort by how many styles there are, how thick the text is. Let's say you want a really thin text. You can sort by that. Or you want a really thick text. And it's only going to show you which fonts have a thick or a thin option. So Work Sans, for example, has 9 different styles. If I click on it, I can see all of them. So it goes from thin all the way to black. Let's toggle back. Now to add our Google Fonts, there's 2 steps that we need to take. Remember in the last slide I said that we can only use web-safe fonts if we want to just add it straight to the CSS. So to use the Google Fonts as an extra step we need to take, we need to add a link to the head section of our HTML, and we'll learn later where that is. In CodePen, we access this via Settings, HTML Stuff for Head, and we just paste in this link. You don't need to remember what this says because you'll copy and paste it from Google. Then we can specify in the CSS which font we want to use. So let's try that now. We'll go to Google Fonts. We will pick the font that we want. It pops up down here. Now we can see it's got the instructions here for us. So we will customize, we'll choose which weights of the font we want. Let's go semi-bold and light. And then we'll copy this link. So I copy that, I go back to CodePen. I can get rid of all of this. This was yesterday's. And we go to Settings, HTML, Stuff for Head, and paste it in. Now we create an element. Let's do a H1. And we can now specify that font in our CSS. Now, if you couldn't remember the wording or how to spell it, you could copy it straight from Google. Put our single quotes. And there we've got it, our new custom font. Pretty simple. If you can't remember, because there are a few little steps involved, if you can't remember, just go to Google Fonts, which ironically enough, I just Google every time I need it. Find the font you want, click the little plus icon. You can see it just here on the first page or where I did it in the demonstration. Then it pops up down here and it'll tell you, copy this code into the head of your HTML, specify this in your CSS. It's all written for you, makes it really easy to use. Now, you might have seen this in the last slide in the Google Fonts, but the next property we've got is the font weight. So we might want to determine whether a font is normal or bold or a specific numerical font weight. Some fonts just come with normal and bold. Some fonts don't even come with bold. They only have one font weight. And some fonts come with lots of different weights that we can select. So if you noticed when I selected Work Sans, and same goes for Open Sans, it gives us everything from 300 to 800 in normal and italic. And importantly, whichever font weights you want to use in your website, you need to add them here. So if you want to have regular and semi-bold and extra bold and light, you need to select every single one before you embed, because it will give you a slightly different embed code for each one. Now, I actually can't remember which ones I selected. So if I were to click on Settings, I can see here in the code which font weights I've selected. I did 300, 400, and 600. So let's try those. First, we can try font weight normal, then font weight bold, then let's try specifically. This is 300, this is 400, and this is 600. So fonts like Work Sans and Open Sans and some of the other Google fonts that have so many variations in the font weight, it really gives us a lot of flexibility in the kind of style that we're after. Text align, another one that's quite straightforward when you read it. This controls the alignment of the text. So if you were to say text align left, right, center, or justify, it would move the text to that alignment. So let's try it. Perfect. Okay, underlines. You may have noticed when we create a link in HTML, it by default looks a bit like this. So the color is blue and it has this underline. It's not a border, it is a specific property called text decoration underline. And even though we haven't written that in our CSS, it's already being applied by the browser. The browser says, I want people to be able to find the links, so let's by default have CSS that says all of our links have text decoration underline. If you want to get rid of that because you want to style your links differently, which is pretty common, you would say text decoration none, and that would remove the underline from your links. The next one is text transform, and this allows us to change the capitalization of the text. So in our HTML, we've just written hello world like this, and by using text transform uppercase, we can make it all capitals. Now, the first question I often hear when I teach this property is, why wouldn't we just write it in the HTML as capitals? And if you're only writing a couple of headings, that is probably a perfectly logical thing to do. But imagine you have a website with 5,000 headings. You wouldn't want to have to go through and change 5,000 different headings in the HTML. You'd want to just write one line of code that targeted all of your headings and changed the style. And that's why we try to keep our style separate from our structure. In our HTML, we write our structure, but anything that has to do with the style, including whether the text is all uppercase, we use the CSS for, just because it's more efficient. So text transform uppercase. Letter spacing. This is something that graphic designers always want to know. You can control the spacing between letters. So you can make it bigger or smaller. You can do positive and negative values, and it gives a little bit of space between each individual letter. So this is the base text with text transform uppercase. And this is the same text with letter spacing of 4 pixels. So we usually use pixels for letter spacing just because it's quite small values. We want to have really precise controls. So it might be 1 pixel, 2 pixels, 10 pixels. You can play around with it. Let's have a look at that now. This is commonly used on buttons to make the text really readable and easy to see. Line height, another common typography tool that designers use. Line height separates the space between each individual line. So here we've got line height 1. Each line is roughly the size of the text itself. It often feels a little bit squished if you're reading a big block of text with line height of 1. Line height 1.5, I would say, is pretty commonly used on the web. Just gives each line a little bit more space around it. Now, this is different to space between paragraphs. See how here the space is within one paragraph. This is one paragraph element. We're just spacing out every line of text. If we want to do space between each paragraph, which is also quite common just to make our blog posts and long form content more readable, we use margin bottom. So in the last lesson, we touched on briefly what margin is. Margin is space around or outside of an element. Margin bottom just means we only want to add it to the bottom. And that makes sense because we're often just trying to separate each line of text. We don't necessarily want to separate all the other space around it. So by putting margin bottom on our typography, it gives us a little bit of space between paragraphs. And this can also be applied to headings and links and any other element. Now, when we're styling our website, we could style every single element individually. We could style our H1s, then our H2s, then our H3s, then our paragraphs, etc., etc. But it's often more efficient to decide what our universal styles, our default styles are, and target them first. So let's say you want your entire website to use the font Lato. Rather than specifying that 6 or 7 times, if we apply the font to the body, then it'll automatically go on all of the other elements. Likewise, if we want to have the main body of our site, the main content of our site, to have a dark grey color like I've used in these slides instead of black, we could set that in the body. So let's have a look at that. We'll put our paragraph element as well. And now, instead of setting the font family on our H1, let's try setting it on the body. So we can see that applies to both of them. Now, if we were to do a color, I often use RGB values for text just because I know off the top of my head what some of the values are. 000 is black, and 255, 255, 255 is white. So in between, you've got shades of grey. So 60, 60, 60 is a pretty dark shade of grey. It's probably more obvious to you guys watching on the video if I make it 90. So that might just give a softness to my whole page, and I've only had to write 2 lines of CSS, 3 if you include the selector. So it's a lot more efficient than if I were writing them all out separately. The next selector, which you haven't seen yet, this is the first time, is our multiple selector. And what we're doing here is selecting the H1 elements and the H2 elements and the H3 elements. And we separate those with a comma in between, not at the end, just in between. And that will select all 3 and apply any styles in between these curly brackets to all 3 of them. And that's particularly useful for headings, as I've shown here. So to give an example, we've got our H1, our H2, and our paragraph, and maybe we want the H1 and the H2 to be red. And maybe we want all our headings to be text transform uppercase. Now, at this point, maybe before, you're probably thinking, okay, how am I going to remember all of these properties? It took me weeks, if not months, to remember even most of these properties, and I still don't know all of them off the top of my head. And importantly, you don't need to. What's more important is that you understand how they work, not that you memorize off the top of your head. Often I will do a quick Google search and go, how to change text to uppercase CSS, and that'll just help jog my memory on specifically what the property is, especially when I was first starting out. Another great resource, which I've linked to in your resources, is cssreference.io. This is a list of all of the CSS properties. And I wouldn't have a look at this until you've already watched this video all of the video tutorials once or twice, just because there are so many CSS properties that it can get a little bit overwhelming. As we scroll down, you can see there's, font family, monospace, there's font size medium, there's just lots of different properties that aren't commonly used. Font style oblique. I've never used that in all of my time as a developer. So it's a really useful reference, but don't let it overwhelm you trying to memorize all of them. There's not a single talented developer that I know that I would say has memorized every single CSS property off the top of their head. Okay, last step. Time for the Code Pen Challenge and for you to test out your typography skills. This is what I want you to create first, and then I want you to have a go at just creating your own complete style. So pick your own fonts, your own colors, play with things like line height and margin, and see what you can come up with. Now, you can view this link. I've included it in your resources, and it looks a little like this. So we've got all our HTML. We've got a H1, a paragraph with a link inside, a H2, another paragraph, etc. and on the right-hand side, you'll see it. Now, what I want you to do is not just read through the CSS. Coding is something that you really learn by doing. I want you to click fork, and what fork does is it creates your own copy that you can then save. So fork it, it's going to load a new one, and then you can save it for yourself. So once you've forked it and saved it, you can have them both open in a separate tab so that you can refer back to mine if you need to. Now, I would have a look at the image that I have shared with you in the resources. Download that onto your computer so you can have it up next to you, and then you can really compare. Does my typography look how I want it to look? So we've started with our CSS reset. We've set our margin to 0. This should say padding. Our margin to 0 and our padding to 0. We've got our body has a little bit of padding, the main page, just to move everything away. If I press Command / that turns that property into a comment. It kind of hides it from the browser. You can see it just all looks a little bit squished. So just by putting some padding around the whole body, it makes it easier to read. I've set my font family to Nanito, and remember we need to follow that 2-step process for Google Fonts where we first added it in the settings and then added it in the CSS. I've made it quite a light font weight. So font weight 300, that's quite light. It gives it that really clean look. And I've set the color of all of the body, so all of the elements by default, and that includes paragraphs and links and other things, although the links we've styled separately, to be dark gray. Then we go through and target each individual element. So we're targeting our H1, we set the color, we set the font weight, we set the font size, we set the line height, we set the margin bottom. Now, before you go and do it yourself, you can actually experiment and see what each line is doing with that little trick I showed you before. So you click on a line, press Command if you're on a Mac or Control if you're on a PC, /, and it toggles it on and off. So I toggle it off, I wrap it in a comment, and I can see what it looked like before that property, and then I can see what it looks like after. So if you're not sure what anything is doing, you can comment it on and off. Now we've got our H2. It's a little bit thicker than the H1. It's 300. We've made it uppercase, so you can see it's lowercase in our HTML, and we've made it uppercase in the CSS. We've set the font size, we've set the letter spacing. So see how there's a little gap between the letters? We've done that with letter spacing. We've set the color. Then we've selected all of our headings and we've put a bit of margin around them. We've selected our paragraphs and given them an additional line height, and we don't have to style anything else about the paragraphs. They've already got their color and their font family from the body. And then we've given our links our feature color, same as we've used for our headings. So that's it. I want you to experiment with commenting them in and out by pressing Command or Control /, and then I want you to go ahead, delete it all, and attempt to recreate it yourself. Good luck!